This incident happened a few years ago when I was a college student in Baltimore, Maryland. I'd found a nice third-floor apartment with 2 friends in a beautiful old building. Being young and naive, we'd often leave the door to our apartment unlocked while we were home, assuming the building's locking entrance door would do the trick. Of course, unless all the tenants made sure to close it entirely on their way out, that door could remain just ajar enough to not lock. Anyone who's lived in a not-so-great area of a city probably knows where this is going. It was really early in the morning and my housemate had just left for work. I was fast asleep in bed. I'm a small person and during the winter like to cocoon myself head to toe in a lot of thick comforters. Anyway, the first thing I remember is waking up, super groggy, to the sound of somebody in my room. It was pretty dark, but I could make out the tall, slim figure of a person who was sort of drifting around by the side of my bedroom. In my half-asleep state, I assumed that it was my housemate. We were close and would often borrow things, an umbrella, a pen, etc., from each other freely, so I figured they were just poking around for something. I promptly emerged from the blanket cocoon and asked in my infamous morning person super cheerful voice, "Can I help you find anything, babe?" The figure turned and jumped about a foot in the air. I realized pretty quickly with a sinking feeling that it was not my housemate, but instead some tall man I'd never seen in my life. I then realized that he hadn't even known I was in the bedroom, room, or apartment at all. He muttered something, I think, about how he thought this was his friend's apartment. I just kind of stared, bewildered, and told him, "Oh, no, sorry. This is my apartment." It was very surreal, and I don't think I fully realized at that point that I was being robbed. With that, he turned and pretty much bolted out through the living room. I learned about 10 minutes later that he grabbed my laptop on his way out, so at least he managed to find something. Suffice to say, lesson learned. We kept all doors to the place locked at all times from that day forward. My friends and I still laugh about it, but I can't help but think about how it could have been a much worse situation if A, it wasn't just some guy committing a crime of opportunity, and B, I hadn't scared him off with my skills as the world's most considerate home invasion hostess. I live in England, in a small town with about 1,000 people there. We are located in the deep countryside, and crime just doesn't happen often apart from the odd stolen bike, etc. I suppose we are quite relaxed about home security and will often leave the door open all day in summer for the dog to walk in and out as he pleases, leaving the cars unlocked and even the house sometimes never with any problems. Maybe our naiveness played a part in this story. It's important to note that my kitchen backs into a public footpath, which in summer is extremely busy with people walking their dogs. They can look straight in the many windows from the footpaths into our kitchen. Now, with the setting explained, I'll get on with the story. I was about 16 at the time, and this story was a couple of years ago. I had taken my dog out for a walk mid-afternoon like I did every day. I grabbed his lead and locked the door and took him out for an hour walk, through the fields that surrounded my house, and then came back. When I came back, I opened the door and placed the keys on the kitchen table and went on with my day. Later on, my mother asked if I had seen the kitchen door key, and I explained that I had left it on the table. She went and looked, and it wasn't there. I then doubted myself, thinking maybe I didn't lock the door when I left, and I dropped it on the walk, although I was certain I could remember leaving it on the table. I didn't think much about it, thinking it would reappear in the house, and if it didn't, I would find it on the walk the next day, as I always walked the same route. The couple days went by, and the key still wasn't found. I searched the house and my walk route, but it couldn't be found. I found it rather strange, as I recall putting it on the table, but I assumed I had imagined it and I must have dropped it. Luckily, we had another key and went on using that key for the door instead. About 4 days after losing my keys, which didn't just have the kitchen door key but also had the front door key on, myself and my mom were disrupted from watching the TV by our dog barking like crazy in the kitchen. This was very out of character for him, as he normally barks in the day when people walk past the kitchen. Me and my mom went in to find out what had upset him, to find the new key had fallen out the door and was on the floor. This was extremely strange because we have extremely old doors since my house is about 200 years old. The keys are very thick, old-fashioned keys, and the only way that they can fall out of the door is if you push a key in from the other side, or that you pull it out. Me and my mom were a little concerned at this point, but decided we were being silly, so we locked and bolted the door and went to bed. When I got to my room, I locked my bedroom door, as I quite often do, to stop my parents disrupting me in the morning. Thank God I did this night as well. The next morning, I was awoken by my father shouting he was leaving for work and he would lock the door. My mom had already left, so it was just me in. I heard him lock the door and I tried to go back to sleep. Roughly 10 minutes later, I heard the door being locked and opened again, and someone comes straight upstairs. I thought nothing of this and assumed my dad had forgotten something. That was till the person walked straight upstairs to my bedroom door and started rattling it forcefully, trying to get it open. I was confused and shouted hello. At this moment, I heard someone sprint from my room and down the stairs, nearly shaking the house. He ran that fast. I knew it wasn't my dad now. I jumped out of bed and unlocked my door and ran downstairs to make sure my dog was okay. When I got to the stairs, I could see the front door was wide open. I panicked and ran outside to see if I could see anyone, but I couldn't. At this point, I started to cry when it finally occurred to me that someone must have seen my keys on the kitchen table, taken them, and tried to get into my house the night before, but was disturbed by my dog. It didn't make sense to me, though, because right next to our front door was my MacBook, 50-inch TV, a mobile phone, all in arm's reach, but the person didn't stop at all. They just walked straight up to my room with purpose. I phoned my brother, who came storming round trying to condole me. He decided he would take me out to get some food after calming me down as much as he could. When we were about to leave, we made sure all doors downstairs were locked and bolted except the front door, which cannot be bolted. My brother also went upstairs and shut every single door of the room upstairs. We went out and came back to the front door, again unlocked. At this point, I was so scared. If once hadn't been enough. We went inside to see again that nothing was stolen. Everything was in its place apart from the laptop and mobile, which we had moved beforehand. We went upstairs to check if anything was gone upstairs, to find when we went upstairs, only one door was open, which was, you guessed it, my bedroom. Nothing I could notice was stolen. You could tell someone had looked around, but I couldn't see anything missing. My parents assumed that I must have had a stalker, which I couldn't pinpoint anyone who it could likely be. Being a teenager with red hair, my hair and looks have always given me, and still to this day get me, unwanted attention of many creepy men, which I will put this encounter down to. We changed the locks on all doors and added extra bolts. We have never had any issues since, but I am still terrified to be home alone. It terrifies me to think what the person's intentions were and how persistent he was at breaking in. I'm so glad I had locked my bedroom door that day, and the intruder wasn't able to barge in. When I was 14, I met a guy named James. He was 17. I dated him for 5 years. I'm 30 now. I grew up very poor to a teenage mother. I never met my father till I was 20. I made some pretty bad choices as a young lady. James was a big-time dealer. At the time, I found that thrilling and so cool. It was a typical abusive relationship. He cheated on me a lot, would physically, mentally, and emotionally abuse me. He would then buy me things or give me money to make it all better. Unfortunately, at the time, I didn't know any better and had a poor self-esteem. His money took me away from my poor home life, so I stayed for 5 years. This happened when I was 17. James and his brother Victor bought a house in a really nice neighborhood. Victor was a single guy, the player type. He had a random girl over visiting that night. James and I were going to bed. It was about midnight. Victor and his new girlfriend left the house and took James's vehicle. James and I were alone in the house. About 2 minutes after Victor left, we heard a knock at the door. James gets up and says, "Oh, he must have forgotten his keys. I'll be right back." I'm in bed. I hear James say, "Yo, you have the wrong house, man. Buzz off." He comes running into the room telling me to close the door as we hear the door getting kicked down. 2 men entered the house. One was wearing a bandana over his face. The other guy I didn't recognize. He wasn't trying to hide his identity. They started kicking down the bedroom door as we did our best to hold our weight against it. We were screaming and begging them to leave. At one point, the bandana guy got his arm and leg through the door. and I made eye contact with him. He dropped his sawed-off shotgun. I reached for it, and he seemed to back off a little bit. The other guy grabbed the gun. Out of fear, I couldn't recognize him, but I felt something in the stare he gave me. We thought maybe they were after money or some sort of contraband. We had no weapons, and all of the illicit stuff was in a separate bedroom. They didn't take anything. It wasn't a robbery. They were there to give someone a beating. James was on the phone with the police the whole time this was happening. The guys took off. It was time to check what they took and hide all of our stuff. The police came, and they noticed a bullet hole in the wall in the bedroom directly beside the room we were in. I found out later it was because Bandana Guy hit the gun out of the other guy's hand as he tried to shoot me through the door. I went home the next day completely traumatized, not wanting to tell my family anything that happened. They all gossip. I walked in the door and my grandmother knew about the home invasion. My family knew James was a dealer and they weren't concerned. I thought at the time someone who James knew must have known someone in my family, since she said a female cousin told her. My cousin Anthony's wife called me saying, "Anthony wants to say sorry, but you weren't supposed to be there." Again, I was dumb and assumed someone in the thug world told them. We lived in a small city. I was so naive and was convinced it was a robbery from another rival dealer. That wasn't the case at all. We spent weeks waiting for them to come back. James made sure he had always had a few scary guys with guns in the house. I realize now that this only adds to my trauma. A few months after this happens, I am at James's house reading the newspaper. I see my cousin Anthony and another guy in the most wanted section. The other guy looked vaguely familiar. Anthony is gang-related. We're the same age and grew up extremely close, although he got locked up at age 13 and has been on and off ever since. Anthony and I would write to each other. We have a strong bond. The phone rings. It's a girl named Carly that is completely in love with Victor, but since he's a player, he treats her like crap. She brings up the mugshots in the paper and says, "That's your cousin, right?" She confesses to me that the home invasion was because of her. The other guy in the mugshot liked her and told him how Victor would slap her around. My cousin Anthony was his friend. They made her tell them where Victor lived, and they watched the house until they had seen what they thought was me and James leaving. She was apologizing profusely, begging me not to tell James. I didn't. I knew if I told him, he would have had her shot, and also because it was my cousin, I assumed I would get some blame or have to show James thugs where my cousin lived. Regardless of what he did, I'm stupidly loyal to family. I saw Anthony at a family function a few years later. He said sorry and that he loves me and that it wasn't his fault. That was 13 years ago. My life is completely different now. I consider myself an upstanding member of society, but I still feel a lump in my throat when I talk about it. I can't even go to a gun range without having an all-out panic attack. I live in the UK, just an ordinary British suburb. Nothing exciting happens, nor anything overly dangerous. Over the years, I've heard stories of how a house a few streets south of my house is owned by a small company, if you can call it that helps mental patients deemed not dangerous. Oh, cool, right? I think nothing of it. On a regular midweek day, an old retired lady is home alone while her husband works. She lives in the corner of my dead-end road, directly next to an alleyway in a creepy little area hidden between houses. Anyway, the story goes that this guy who apparently was mentally unstable who belongs to that home came out alone from the alleyway and proceeds through this old lady's back gate. Luckily for her, as he passes down the side of the house, she sees a figure move quickly past a window in the corner of her eye. She moves through the house in the direction of the movement. As they're both moving in the same direction, they both end up in plain view of each other, separated by only a glass patio and sliding door. He reaches for the door handle, and fortunately for the old lady, it's locked. After an immediate struggle to get the door open, he pulls out a pair of scissors and attempts to hack the windows and door open. This fails. Thank God for double-glazed windows. As this is happening, this lady, who I presume is absolutely terrified, calls the police, as you would. He fails at getting inside the house and begins to get the clothes from the washing line in her garden and cuts up all her and her husband's clothes. He left and got away before the police turned up and simply left her mortified. After this, I noticed CCTV cameras go up in that area, and this is how it could affect me. This got me thinking. As a kid, I was always haunted of the idea of home invasion, strangers coming into my house, taking me, robbing me, hurting me, etc. But as I grew up, I grew out of that fear and wasn't really bothered. I lived in a relatively safe area, so I kind of never had my guard up. Over the summers, my dad gets home from working nights at about 8 and 9 a.m. and leaves my downstairs patio and sliding doors open leading to the back garden so my dog could go in and out of the garden as she pleased, as it's summer and it's hot, because my dad thought keeping her indoors would be mean while he came home and slept for a few hours in the day. To this point, as my dad would return home and feed my pet and open the doors and go to sleep, I would be asleep, not having woken up yet, being a typical lazy teen. So, after this creepy story of the weird man and the old lady, it was brought to my attention that it could have easily been us, a guy willing to creep through the back gate and enter my house with a clearly open and unlocked back door. At the right time, I could have been fast asleep and had to bust up out of bed and defend myself, or not. Something crazy could have happened as, of course, he was wielding a weapon. And still, out of habit and forgetfulness, I resumed leaving the back door open in the middle of the day. As for the guy, he's still out there, and it very much could be my house he visits next. So I was living in Venice, California about a year ago. I lived in a 4-bedroom apartment with 3 other ladies, all of us in our mid to late 20s. The apartment setup is pretty complicated. Our apartment is a standalone building and there are 2 other standalone apartments in front of ours, side by side. This forms a pretty private courtyard for our apartment, not accessible to the neighbors. My bedroom and my roommate Jesse's bedroom both have a large sliding glass door that opens onto the courtyard, and the front door of the apartment is accessed from the courtyard as well. In order to get into the courtyard, you have to open a spike-top locked gate, walk down a pathway between the 2 apartments in front of us, and open the locked door to the courtyard. The courtyard is enclosed by 12-foot cinder block walls, and on the other side is the neighbor's gated narrow side yard and alleyway, and a few side yards between that. So basically the building is completely blocked in and very hard to access, and requires 3 different keys to gain access to the actual apartment. This isn't a great neighborhood, but we felt pretty safe when we moved in. About 2 months after we move in, it's 6 a.m. on a Sunday, and we're all home and in our rooms asleep. Jesse's boyfriend is asleep in bed with her, and I have a new guy over for the first time as well. Jessie has a 60-pound dog, and she leaves her sliding door partially open at night for the dog to go in and out. Keep in mind, we're inside 12-foot walls and are completely enclosed by other houses and apartment buildings, so those walls themselves aren't even accessible by anyone but our immediate neighbors, so leaving this door open does not seem risky at all. I mean, seriously, someone would have to be incredibly dedicated and have intimate knowledge of the layout of the place to pull off any sort of successful robbery, so leaving the door open felt safe. So it's 6 a.m. and Jessie's dog starts barking. She opens her eyes just in time to see through her sheer curtain the silhouette of a man drop inside the courtyard from the 12-foot wall. The dog bursts out of the door barking, and for some reason the guy shushes the dog, pushing him back inside and slides the door shut. Then he goes to the front door between Jesse's bedroom and mine and starts knocking. I'm about 50% awake at this point, and it slowly dawns on me that if someone is knocking on that door, they must have somehow bypassed the other 2 locked doors, and something is not right. Jessie is also about 50% awake, which causes her to assume that this is a person we know, so she opens the door for him. Note, this girl is literally a rocket scientist. She's not dumb, save your judgment. He pushes open the door and forces his way inside. She fully wakes up real fast and says, "Nope, I don't know you," and shoves him back out, locking the door. He goes back to our sliding door, which he knows is unlocked, and walks in. Jesse's boyfriend, Mike, in nothing but his whitey tighties, flies out of bed and shoves him back out into the courtyard. Jesse runs in and shuts the sliding door, locking it by the really advanced method of laying a long piece of wood in the track because our insane landlady won't install real locks. The piece of wood isn't quite long enough, so the door can still be opened about 2 inches. So after securing that door as best as possible, she bursts into my bedroom, at which point I fully awaken. I'm naked in bed with an equally naked dude. She runs to my sliding door and locks it. This one actually works, and when she pulls back the curtain, I see Mike in the courtyard in a very physical fight with a guy I definitely do not know. Mike is a super non-violent data scientist nerdy type for the record, and he is fighting with a not very big but still bigger than Mike angry looking dude. Mike is on the ground getting his face pummeled into the flagstone, and the dog is running around barking but otherwise being pretty unhelpful. Mike is trying to reason with the guy the whole time, saying, Hey, we don't want any of this. You can just leave, it'll be fine. And the guy stops just long enough for Mike to grab his arms, push him off, and jump up. Mike says, Hey, here's the door, just leave, and opens the door that leads from the courtyard out to the pathway towards the gate. The guy somehow manages to shove both Mike and the dog out that door and locks it behind them. So now the guy has barricaded himself in our courtyard, Mike and dog on one side, my now mostly clothed self, 3 other terrified girls, and one now mostly clothed guy still inside the apartment. There is one other way out of this apartment, and that is through the garage. Except it turns out our landlady is pretty incompetent with locks in general, so the garage door is brilliantly set up such that the lock is only accessible from the outside. Yeah, we're completely trapped inside this building, and the guy is working on Jesse's sliding door again. My other roommate, Emily, whose room is upstairs but facing the courtyard, has been on the phone with 911 the whole time. She's explaining the situation as best she can, and the 911 operator is telling her that since the guy is technically only in our yard, it's not a priority and we can't really do anything. He needs to be in the house to consider it an emergency. So the guy who was formerly naked takes the phone and very calmly says something to the effect of, This man has bypassed 2 locked doors and scaled a 12-foot wall to access the location he is currently occupying. He has forced his way into the house twice. He has assaulted one person and has locked the assaultee out. He is currently attempting to access the house again through a door which has no lock and whose glass is thin enough to break, if you were to ask it nicely enough. We have no weapons and no way out. You need to get here as soon as possible. Fortunately, the police were already on their way because the neighbor had called them about a raving lunatic in whitey-tighties who was running around the street yelling for someone to call 911 and apparently now, for some reason, wielding a hockey stick. As we're watching the guy as best we can from the upstairs window, his behavior starts to change. He stops trying to open the door and begins pacing. He peeks around things. He looks behind him. It becomes apparent he's been running from something and is now bracing himself in case they catch up. Cops? Violent gangs with guns? We honestly have no idea, and that's actually super scary. At one point he disappears from the window's view, so I run up to the roof deck to see what he's doing. As I peer down, I'm startled to realize he's a lot closer to me than I expected because he's climbing a tree that shoots straight up to the roof deck. Note, I later tried climbing that same tree, and seriously the dude must have had superpowers. Totally sure of it. But then he decides he won't go all the way up. He'll just drop onto the roof of the little shed-type thing that houses the hot water heater. He lays on his stomach and peers around the corner, then sits back on his knees pulled up and starts kind of rocking. Oh. It's suddenly super obvious that this guy is out of his mind. This is later confirmed by Mike, who eventually retires his hockey stick and thankfully puts on pants, informing us that when he tried to offer the guy an exit through the open door, the guy replied, "No, there's danger behind that door." And that's when he shoved him and the dog out and presumably sacrificed them to whatever horrors lay in wait on the other side. After a short time of watching him switching between paranoid peeking and paranoid rocking, the cops finally show up. They calmly convince him to just come down and they peacefully cuff him. No, really, it was actually pretty chill. The cops basically said they thought he was on something or multiple things, but probably mostly PCP. He had apparently been living with his aunt in a nearby apartment complex, and must have been just as confused about how he got into our place as we were. From our rooftop deck, you could see where he had broken a wooden fence to get from a side yard into the neighbor's alley. You could also see the tiered wooden plant stand the neighbor had propped against the wall that the guy had scaled to get into our courtyard. And they eventually charged him with a few counts of assault, but couldn't charge him for trespassing because we didn't have any no trespassing signs. The story takes place in Monterrey, Mexico when I was about 10 years old. If you don't know, Monterrey is actually a pretty crime-infested city. It's beautiful, you just gotta know in what spots you are in. All throughout my childhood, I would visit and live in Mexico during the summers, so I can be around my family that still lives there to this day. Although the summer of 2009 was the last summer my family would be going there for obvious reasons I'm about to present. So all of my family from my mom's and dad's side all live in the city called Monterrey in Mexico. I'm pretty sure much of you probably don't know the place, but let's just say it's not the most safe city to be in, especially with the current situation Mexico has with narcos and crime. Me and my two brothers, however, never saw it this way, and instead thought more of our cousins and family. We lived in a 2-story house in a regular neighborhood, nothing fancy or expensive, just normal, I guess. There had always been problems with corrupt police and robberies throughout the night, but I never expected to be a victim of it. One particular night, me and my two brothers, all between the ages of 8 and 12, were home alone with just my mom since my dad had gone out to go drinking with my uncles. Before the sun set, my mom was already a nervous wreck after supposedly seeing the same white Toyota pass by our house more than a couple of times. My mom took this very seriously due to the fact that her side of the family had fallen victim to break-ins similar to what was happening. However, she did not want to scare us and just told us that today we had to be going to sleep earlier than usual. My father didn't own a phone and still doesn't, mostly because he's an old traditional type of guy, so my mom couldn't just call him to come home. I was confused as me and my brother Louis looked at each other with a disappointed reaction as we wanted to stay up later in the living room and play some Call of Duty. But my mom wasn't having it and demanded we go to our room early. My oldest brother Mario was soon catching up to the events and even looked a little worried now that I remember. We all slept in the same room that night, but we couldn't get any sleep. Midnight rolled around and me and my brothers were joking around when suddenly we heard a small creak coming from downstairs. The sound was usually made when the back door was open. Since the house was mostly empty and pretty old, you could basically hear anything at a time like night when the house was quiet. Frozen, my brothers and I stayed quiet. "Is that Dad?" Mario asked, but I knew this was not possible since my dad always comes home around morning time since he doesn't drink and drive. "What if it's those guys from afternoon?" Louis said in a jokingly voice. Although I gotta admit my heart dropped at the sound of that. We all stayed quiet to try and hear any noise when all of a sudden we could hear whispers coming from downstairs. We froze in shock as we knew that this was not any of our family members. The more and more we listened, I could make up the voices of about 2 or 3 people down there. I had never really felt adrenaline before in my life, but I could feel it with every pump my heart gave. I started thinking of the worst, of those kids that got kidnapped and never returned stories. Then with a shocking decision, my oldest brother said that he would take a peek. "Are you crazy?" I said, wanting to shout but obviously couldn't. "Chill out, it's probably just Mom with our uncles or something," he replied. After about 20 seconds, which seemed like minutes at the time, he returned to add to our horror. He returned pale and was shaking so much I had to tell him to calm down. When he finally spoke, his voice with stutter, he murmured the words, "Guys, there's someone's down there." My stomach twisted with those words and I could feel my heart pumping faster than ever. But before we could react, I heard the most bone-chilling scream I had ever heard. The scream was so horrific at first I didn't even recognize it was my mother's. In the span of seconds, my mom ran through the hallway into our room and locked the door. I could hear so many footsteps coming up the stairs in rapid movement. I was in shock as I realized what was happening. My brother Louis was crying frantically next to me. My mom threw us in the corner of the room farthest from the door and began trying to open the window. The men were pounding hard at the door, but I mean hard. I honestly thought that in that moment we were all gonna die or get kidnapped. I burst into tears as I saw my mom screaming out at the top of her lungs out the window calling for help. Never had I heard the sound of despair coming from my mom's voice. From what little I could understand, the men were shouting in Spanish to shut up and things along the lines of break this door down. I must have had panic attack because all I remember was waking up to the sounds of sirens coming from the end of the block. I could hear the men's footsteps running down the stairs and out the back door. Turns out our neighbor, God bless her, had seen the group of thugs since the beginning and alerted the cops as soon as they heard them in our backyard. The police searched everyone, even went on to the next 2 streets, but as we all know, they were long gone. For a long time after, I had nightmares and would have panic attacks when I would hear small voices at night. But as the years went on, so did my fear. My mom has never wanted to go back, and if we ever did, it would be in a hotel, she always says. My dad tried to sell the property, but when my uncle went to go check the place out, it had already been broken in and some stuff was missing. Nothing valuable, but just gives me more reason for never wanting to go back. Mexico can be a fun place, but please do be careful. Sometimes the police officers won't help, so in some situations, you're all alone. So about a month ago, I was home alone. My mom, who I live with, was gone at her boyfriend's house, and my younger sister was at a friend's sleepover. For reference, I'm a 17-year-old male. It was dark out and I was lying in bed watching Netflix with my dog, watching Forensic Files on Netflix, and I decided I was hungry. But I wasn't sure if I actually wanted to get up or eat or not, so I texted my best friend Elliot and asked if I should or not. He said something along the lines of, yeah, get up and make some food. So I got up to make one of my go-to favorite meals, frozen chicken nuggets. The way my house is laid out, my bedroom is next to my mom's on the right side, and on the left side is a door to my sister's room. She also has a door leading to the living room. So I walk down the hall and stop when I realize that the front door is completely open, and I start to get a bad feeling as I have OCD and the door in my house always have to be shut and locked, and I make sure they are every time I enter or exit the house. I shake off the feeling, deciding it was just my mom who left the door open, as I was in my room when she left and I never actually saw her leave. I go into the kitchen and preheat the oven to 425 to start making my chicken nuggets when I hear a loud thump, as if someone hit their arm against one of our doors. The bad feeling comes back then, and I go into a panic, so I grab my dog and leash him up and almost run out the door and text my boyfriend, asking him if he can come pick me up from a nearby store, as I'm afraid there's someone in my house and I don't have a car. He says he will. I call my mom and tell her, and she tells me I need to stick around and call the police, so I do. The 911 operator tells me to go to the neighbor's house, and I stay there until the police get there. I do, and the police are in my driveway in 7 minutes. I go back over to my house to talk to the officers, and as I'm talking to one of them, the 2 officers who went into my house to search it come out with a very tall, ratty-looking man with blonde dreadlocks and eyes that look like they're bulging out of his head. I'm staring at him, and as they're taking him away from my house into the police car, he shouts at me, "You little demon, I'm going to get you." My panic state is reintroduced until my boyfriend finally shows up at my house. The next day, someone from the police station calls me to tell me that the man had been scoping out our house and was planning to rob us. And when he realized I was home, he grabbed one of our big kitchen knives and hid in my sister's room and was waiting to stab me. And he would have if I hadn't gotten out of the house. I'm so thankful that I listened to my gut feeling and got out. Hey guys, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed these narrations and wish to support the channel further, please consider joining me on Patreon, where for only $1 or more a month you'll have early access to all future narrations up to 24 hours before they're released on YouTube. And check out shop.spreadshirt.com/letsread to see all the newest channel merch. Thanks so much, and I'll see you again soon.